Yes, thank you. My name is Terry Fach, campus chaplain at Ambrose University and sometime lecturer in various things, and also a pastor. And yeah, that's what I do up here at Ambrose University. Glad to be part of this interfaith conversation today.
And hi to all the viewers and to my fellows on screen here. I am A.W. Barber, the Director of Asian Studies at the University of Calgary. My research area is Buddhism, and I am also a Buddhist priest. So.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'm your host, Father Adrian. I'm a member of the Calgary Interfaith Council. Among a few other things I do here at the city, I also work at the Calgary Catholic School District, as well as the Diocese of Calgary. And brothers, the first question I want to ask you here is, in your faith communities, respectively in Christianity and in Buddhism, is there any aversion to the word religion? Is that word sort of kind of falling out of vogue? Is there spirituality? Does that take its place? Or is there any aversion to it? And why, do you think, if that's so?
I could go first, Tony. I tend to think there is some aversion to the word religion. Certainly the preferred term, even within my Christian tradition, I think is Christian spirituality. I think the word is easier to talk about with those who do not embrace some kind of devout religious way of life or belief. So at that level, I think there's a bit of stigma and uncertainty about the word religion. I mean, I could go on. I think when the talk is of religion, sometimes there's also, I believe, we would benefit from a greater understanding of the phenomenon, of the human phenomena related to religion and religious curiosity and practice across cultures and groups. And so I do think that we don't appreciate what religion means, the roots of the word, the way it functions, and what a religion does in our human lives. I'll stop there.
Well, that was good. Okay. You know, in the Buddhist community, things are a little more complex. There's not necessarily an aversion to using the word religion per se, but we don't normally identify as a religion, right? And so if I might take a couple of minutes and kind of explain why that is and you know where we go, right? So at least as I understand it, the word religion is of course derived from the Latin religio, and that was defined as deorum cultus, or the worship of God, right? And it's connected with the word religio, meaning to bind, and also having rites, ritus, right? So in the Roman times, the term cultus, right? So it's the cult of the god, right? The term cultus was sometimes used similar to our understanding of the word cult, in the sense of it not being, you know, being unorthodox or a sort of an unusual religion. However, it still maintained more of a sense of how, let us say, anthropologists today use the word religion, meaning more like a pattern of actions in response to beliefs, right? So the term religion in Roman times was often used for what today we would call the cult of a particular god, like the cult of Isis or the cult of Mithras or the cult of Dionysus. And in those times, Christianity was in that group, right? Because it wasn't part of the Greco-Roman religions, right? So the bond for Christianity is in those early days was understood as being, you know, either the monastic vow or kind of like an initiation type of ceremony, right? So we find the idea of this bond and rights is still part of the defining characteristics of the word religion, even in 1200 Oxford University Dictionary. The action or conduct indicated a belief, a reverence for, a desire to please a divine ruling power, the exercise or practice of rites or observances implying this. Right? So that was kind of the definition at that time. What happened is that after Martin Luther in the 16th century, the notion of bond and rights fades and the notion of faith or belief increases, right? And so it's faith and belief that become the defining characteristic of the word religion. And so I bring this up because, the definition changed, and that has an important for the discussion of these Asian traditions, right? So after Christianity gained ascendancy in the West, the intellectuals of the church knew of only two religions, Christianity and Judaism, right? The ancient Roman tradition was gone, the ancient Egyptian religions were gone, right? And both Christianity and Judaism had this idea of a bond and rights. Later, with the rise of Islam, it too could be called a religion because it fit that general pattern. Right? Of course, all three of these are considered Abrahamic religions. Right? When the Portuguese in the 1500s, and then the Spanish and the Dutch and so on in the 1600s, sailed over to Asia, right? South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia. These Europeans saw people with engaging in these activities with the eyes of, this understanding, this sort of, Catholic bond and rights understanding. So when they looked at Hinduism and they saw priests and yogis, and they looked at Buddhism and they saw monks and nuns, and they looked at Taoism and they saw priests, right? The Europeans, viewing it through that kind of Catholic eyes, classified all these things as religions. Right? Okay, so, but as you can see from what I just said, this predates Luther. So the change in the definition hadn't taken place yet, right? When, of course, that change did take place, then that's where the problem came in with classifying these traditions as religions, right? So if we were talking about pre-Luther times, I would agree that Buddhism and Taoism and Confucianism are religions because it's basically bonds and rights, right? But once we start redefining the word religion as being faith, right, then we have a real problem because, for example, in Buddhism, although people say Buddhism is atheistic, that's just wrong. Buddhism recognizes a whole lot of gods, but the gods are unimportant in the Nirvana project, right? Same with certain parts of Hinduism. Some parts of Hinduism are very faith-based. You have the bhakti movements and that type of thing. But other faith doesn't play a role, even though none of them will deny that there's gods, right? And the same with Confucianism, right? The gods aren't denied by Confucianism, but they're just not important. And so that's, talking about Asian religion is kind of problematic because if we understand religion as being something about faith, whatever that might be, this is where we run into a problem. And so a lot of people use the word spirituality instead, right? Just because it's kind of a catch-all. Right? It's also, the word spirituality has been so watered down now. It covers so much in Western society, spirituality, right? It's almost like the word Zen, right? I was in the grocery store one day and in the cereal aisle, and there was a breakfast cereal called Optimum Zen. I thought, okay, well, I guess there's a little bit of nirvana in every bite,
There's 2% more whole wheat. That's what makes it Zen.
I guess so. Yeah. So, but anyhow, so that's why it's like in a lot of Buddhist communities, they don't mind to use the word religion, but they just don't associate themselves as being a religion.
maybe I'll just add to what Tony has said, that as you become a little more analytical in my tradition, we do distinguish our version of religion as a theistic religion, as Tony mentioned. And so that kind of sets the course, if you will, for many of the kinds of conversations you would have in the study of the Christian religion. As a theistic religion, it posits the existence of a personal God. So God, in this case, does play a very central and significant role. And thinking about God in the a priori and a posteriori ways of trying to understand God, God's revelation of himself, that is the focal point of a theistic religion. And I would then just add, in a complementary way, I hope, that I don't want to be too dismissive of the fact that we still are wanting, in many circles in our society, our highly secularized society, to talk about spirituality. We may jettison the word religion for good and bad reasons, perhaps, but at least there's an interest in a spiritual dimension. And I think, even though it may be skewed toward or adulterated, if I may say, by sort of extreme individualism or libertarianism, at least many people are open and acknowledge that there's a spiritual dimension to life, one that perhaps transcends the purely material.
And maybe just to build off of both of your points there, in both of your traditions here, it's very interesting. I mean, because it seems like there's almost like a dominant word in some of our subcultures of religion, but then there's this move towards spirituality. There's a popular video coming out of the evangelical tradition on YouTube about the fact that we shouldn't be religious but spiritual. Let's talk about that. To what degree, and then I know, Tony, you mentioned it too, that maybe spirituality is sort of like turned into, sometimes it's very influenced by consumerism and other things. But tell me how the word spirituality plays out in your traditions, and what sort of ramifications does that have within your traditions and within modern society?
And Terry, why don't you go?
Okay. Well, I just said that the fact that we still want to talk about spirituality is a good thing. But I think one of the challenges in my tradition is that we tend to be heavily influenced by other kinds of, let me call them secular liturgies, cultural liturgies, that are deeply woven into sort of being a Western modern person, if I may, exclude the conversation in that way, or narrow it down. And by that I mean, sometimes spirituality in my tradition seems to get confused with talk about therapy for being happy, therapy for being successful, spirituality as something for me and so I think that the challenge in the Christian tradition, in many of its iterations these days, is to look for an authentic spirituality of integrity that would link to the way of Jesus Christ, which does not strike many who read the Gospels as a sort of a strategy for being happy. It's a calling to a kind of a way of living. And indeed, I have to say that my brothers and sisters in some of the other religions, I think, do a better job of facing things like suffering and the suffering in life in a more realistic and honest way. As much as spirituality talk is positive and good, I think the challenge for us is to distill what a true Christian spirituality is going to look like. And it's one that is not purely individualistic. In fact, it's not mainly individualistic. It's highly communitarian. And it's certainly one that is an invitation to embrace a certain amount of necessary suffering in life. And that's not an easy message. And that's, a lot of people don't want that Jesus. So I'll leave my comments there.
Geez, for a minute there, I thought you were a Buddhist. Because, of course, Buddhism starts from that point. There is suffering in the world, right? And then, so what are you going to do about it? Right? And that's true. I think there's several things that you indicated, and I want to kind of flesh those out a bit more. One of the things in the development in the world was the enlightenment. And the Enlightenment has given us incredible miracles, if you will, in medicine, in science, technology, and so on. I mean, if our ancestors 5 years ago could how ours are now, they would think it's just incredible. But one of the problems with the European Enlightenment is that it had a very strong tendency towards anti-Christ. And it's all well and fine, the realm of like in Buddhist teachings, going way back, the realm of logic and the realm of, putting things into the light of reason, which is what Enlightenment was, right, has its limits. It's all well and fine, it's good, it's useful, but it has its limits, and that's not the only way of knowing, of experiencing, right? And this is what the European Enlightenment never understood, that those limits were there. And I think those limits are exactly what religion or spirituality address. They address some other aspect of our life, right? And that aspect we know about, because if we look at culture from any time period in any place on this planet, there was no people who didn't have religion or spirituality, whatever you want to call it, right? So we know that there's this whole other area that's just not part of the realm of logic, right? It's not saying it's denying logic, it's just saying that there's more things to life than just, the formulas. Right? Okay, so that's kind of part of it. I think also there's been a this sort of psychologicalizing of religion, right? Well, you do religion because it gives you this kind of psychological help, right? Actually, if you look at Buddhist material, and I know some of the Christian material, a lot of the people who were held up in these traditions as being great insightful saints or great masters or whatever, like if you analyze what they went through, they weren't necessarily getting a lot of psychological benefit. They were, you take Saint Agnes, right? I mean, she really had a lot of issues. And of course, the ecstasy of her experience and whatnot was a whole nother side of things. But and it's the same in Buddhism. There's a lot of discussion in Buddhism about these great masters, but before they became great masters, psychologically they went through a lot of difficulties, right? And so this kind of making spirituality psychological, and I find, well, that it's yes, it might have that, and certainly like in Buddhism, we know from 50 years of scientific experiments, sitting in meditation has psychological benefits, right? There's little doubt about that anymore. Okay, but that's not and I tell people this all the time. That's not what it is. It's not, you're just going to sit here and kind of, chill out and, that type of thing. Yes, that happens, but that's really the side effect. It's not what you're aiming for, right? So you have that as well. And then the other thing is that I think Western society has lost its aim in general, right? Our society, because of, as you mentioned, Terry, the kind of secular whole thing is like, be happy, right? But it shouldn't be, right? We know from the ancient Greeks and certainly from the Asian traditions, it's have a good life. But have a good life is not the same thing as be happy. Right. And sometimes people have, a very, very good life, but they weren't very happy. Right. And you could enumerate a number of examples in that line. So I think, these things came together, and that's why we're having a lot of problems within, all the spiritual communities, because the very way that we're trying to look at it is starting from false positions. Not necessarily everyone, but a lot of the conversation starts out from these kind of false positions.
Maybe to go to our next question, it's a good segue. These days, there's sort of a little bit of an aversion, and maybe maybe consumerism also plays into this too, an aversion to structure and institutions. Do you think that this is true, that there is a modern aversion to structure and institutions, or sort of an anti-institution mentality? And why do you think this is, if this is true, why do you think this has come about in our society, and how does it influence religion?
Well, I could take a stab at this one. I have some, a lot of things come to mind when you ask that question, Father Adrian. At one level, I think there is a palpable distrust of institutions. And you see that manifested in a wide range of ways. I mean, for example, the challenge of getting younger Canadians engaged in the political process to get them to go and vote. There's some apathy there, but certainly I don't think there's if you look at the polling and the reports and surveys on who is esteemed in society, and some of the ways that institutions that were once revered and considered guiding lights are suspect. What else? Another phenomenon, as I'm just sort of pulling some straws from the wind here, if you think about the phenomenon in the 20th century of non-denominational Christianity, the sort of dissolution of some historic kinds of institutional structures, the dissension, the fragmentation. So, yeah, I think institutionally we're less trusting than we once were, and part of that too, I think, is sort of the fumes of the Enlightenment. Autonomy and trust in our own abilities to reason, and we don't want anyone telling us what to do, and so we don't think we want someone telling us what to do. But I think what has happened, though, is that we've actually discovered that it may not be institutions we want, but we are looking for meaning. We are looking for guidance. We are looking for a compass. And sadly, sometimes that's a demagogue or something that has a promise, a short-term delivery of, promised happiness or something like that. But so those would be my thoughts. I would concur that we are institutionally suspicious, and that continues to be part of the the religious landscape that we deal with as religious people and as part of religious organizations.
I would add to that, in that I think this anti-institutional stance has been greatly exaggerated in the 21st century because of the media, right? People generally, would like to have, perfection. And when they find out that some institution had a problem, right? Then they now, because of it just being, whatever that problem is, it'll be just everywhere in the media, right? So the online, the Twitter, everything will just jump on the problem. Whereas before all of this electronic media, if there was a problem, it was rather localized. And so, your particular institution, like, your city government or your school or your church or whatever had some issue, and it was a local phenomena and people would deal with it. And, but now it becomes like this, international nightmare for everyone. And so I think the media has played a considerable role in destroying people's faith in institutions, right? Now, just to kind of speak personally, if I might, I struggled with this a lot myself. Within Buddhism, and Buddhism is a world religion. It has quite a few institutions. Particularly because I lived in Asia for many years. And so I was, very much involved in all sorts of Buddhist institutions over there. I found it difficult at times because, there is no perfection on this planet, right? And you have to come to terms with that, which I did, but it took me some time to mature in my own life, my own experience, my own thinking and whatnot, to realize, first of all, perfection is impossible. It's a great idea and we should try to reach it, but we have to understand we're never going to do that, at least here, right? Maybe in the afterlife, it might be different now. I'll let you know when I get there. I'll send you a text message. So you have to kind of come to terms with the fact that there is no perfection here. And the other thing that occurred to me, which helped me a lot, was realizing that you have to have, this imperfect institutions in order for the traditions to be carried forward for those people who need that type of education or that type of connection, et cetera, right? And to kind of pick up on this idea, right? For me, I think the really important thing about these institutions is what they can teach us, and that implies discipline, right? In terms of churches and spirituality and these types of things, right? You cannot make up your own discipline for spiritual purpose. You might think you can, and you might, fiddle around with some stuff and make yourself believe that you're doing something or another that's really of value, but it's not. And the example that I always like to give is, think about how many times you made a New Year's resolution and actually kept it, right? Right. So, when you learn what your tradition is, it doesn't matter, it's Christianity or Buddhism or Taoism or Hinduism, whatever, you learn what that tradition is. Basically what you're doing is you're learning the discipline for that tradition. And it's a given. it's not like, well, you just can make it up as you go along, right? It's something that is there, and that's part of what the institutions do, is they maintain that so that it doesn't just break down and then your version of Christianity is just do everything and whatever, and then hopefully at the end of the life you just say, oh, forgive me, Jesus, and you're good. That's you can't approach it that way, right? So but I think this is something that ought to be taught to kids. Yes, the democratic republics, which we all live in, are not perfect. We hope to make them perfect. We hope to keep working to get them better, right? But they're not perfect, and so let's understand that and try to make it better. The churches aren't perfect, right? It's not heaven. It's too bad. But like when you walk through the door of the church, it's not going to be heaven on the inside, right? Let's try to make it that way. Let's try to use that as our guiding principle. But you have to understand, it's still the human world, and so it's a path to get somewhere, right, and not the goal, right? So that's kind of how I came about it, because of I don't know, for whatever reason, when I was young, I kind of became rather anti-institutional. But more so in a sense of being sarcastic than being radical. I wasn't out picketing. I was just like, yeah.
Maybe both reflecting off of what you both said here, which were amazing, beautiful points. From the Catholic tradition, it's interesting that there's a lot of reflection on the institutionalism of Jesus, especially in this account where he makes Peter the rock of the church, this unexpected sort of apostle, right? Where, we sort of understand it too. He makes him, he basically sets up the church. He gives him the power of the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Basically the prime ministership of the church is given to Peter. And yet in a few verses later, he says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." So this other, like, you do need the importance and function of institutions, because that's how human, and again, maybe to reference Hegel here, the first human institution is the family, and everything is sort of an echo of the family. You have to have structure, you have to have order, headship, everything else. But even behind that, though, is the individual conviction of the person. Are they really, truly living out their role within the institution, within the family? Maybe another question.
If I might interject,
Oh, yeah.
I like that. And one of the reasons I really like that is because in the Chinese tradition of Buddhism, right? When you become a monk or a nun, you actually are kind of adopted into the Buddhist family. So they all end up with the Buddhist family name as part of their name.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So, yeah.
I think there's something out of the evangelical background kind of history of the difference of kind of calling each other brother and sister and things like that. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I don't know if I can actually, but what I would want to add to what we've just been talking about is the fact that I think, it's a very complex matter to think about institutions generally and the church as an institution specifically. I just thought what Tony said was very good about this idea that if we think institutions are something they fundamentally aren't and can't be, then it's likely that we have unrealistic expectations of them and will be hurt by them. There's that. I think we're also living in an age of reckoning, certainly just at a secular moral level, as we are facing up to the kinds of sin, as we say in the Christian tradition, that manifests itself in complex ways in these institutional ways. I think if we're thinking clearly by the lights of our own doctrine and beliefs, we don't regard any human institutions as ultimate. There is only the kingdom of God that is ultimate. And all of these other kingdoms are, in some sense, subservient or secondary, and do not command our ultimate loyalty. And hence, when they fail, I think those are good opportunities for us to acknowledge, systemic racism is a good example of that. And yeah, so I just wanted to add that.
Oh, that's true. That's great. And maybe if we can go to another question here. And this is maybe, Terry, if you can answer first here, because I mean, you would probably trace some of your Christian background to the Protestant Reformation, but what do you think the influence the Protestant Reformation had on the modern psyche of how we understand faith? And then maybe to kind of add to that too, and I think there's a little bit less knowledge of this in terms of what happened with the Catholic Reformation sort of in the Western psyche, where that basically, the way that sort of influenced Catholicism is this this culture of Catholics coming to confession throughout the year, especially kind of in the Catholic idea of things, that when someone commits a very serious sin or even less serious, that they would come to confession. So this idea of a growth of the personal spirituality of Christians, which obviously had it had a big influence on the Reformation and sort of the reform of Christianity within Protestantism. Yeah, if you can sort of expand, what influence does that, as we think about structure, religion, all these questions, what influence do you think it has now?
Yeah, it's a huge question. I feel a little out of my league in addressing it, but I mean, you've mentioned some of them. Just using broad strokes here, I think the Protestant Reformation I regard as an expression of modernity in many ways. It just doesn't influence modernity. It is in its earliest guise a modern movement towards the individual, a flattening, if you will, of the spiritual landscape and the hierarchies. This idea that there is I'm going to just use some phrases that everybody knows. There's a priesthood of all believers. There's a access for all to God in ways that previously weren't thought possible or people were aware of. And those are some of the things that come to mind. I mean, also and I'm not describing this only in sort of approval, terms of approval. I mean, I think you then begin to get some ambiguity. Who is authoritative? Who teaches? Who interprets Scripture? And so, is there a teaching office? And so you get this fragmentation, and I'm not sure that that's always been good. I think the other thing would be again tracing these threads, causal threads, is a complex and contentious matter. But eventually, in Protestantism, you also get a very intellectual version of faith as well. Whereas you might say pre-Reformation expressions of worship may have been some ways been very mechanical or transactional and not personal. You might say that some of the ways that Reformation influences Christianity as a modern movement is that it makes Christianity more of a doctrinal and intellectual endeavor at some level, where there's a focus on correct belief, not just on correct living. So not always a helpful movement in that direction, but certainly that's a modern expression, I think.
Very interesting. Tony, what do you think about all these things, kind of reflecting on this from a Buddhist perspective, and what role have you sort of seen that within, I mean, that's Western society, if we can even use that term?
All right, well, it's so there's several things here, but one thing, of course, is that the Protestant traditions were very active in Asia as missionaries and so what, and that did have a big effect, and so were the Catholics, of course. Father Ricci was with the Ricci Institute was a great example of that. But they had a big effect on Buddhism in the late 19th and in the 20th century. Some of it is kind of just curious. For example, East Asian Buddhist robes traditionally were very elaborate. So in Japan, after when they started in their modernization in Japan in the mid 1800s, a number of traditions remodeled their robes to look like Protestant ministers, because they thought that was kind of the new fashion for religion. But it had a lot more other more profound impact too, which was great. Because the dialogue, right? And they're going, they're talking and they're discussing and they're and they're developing in light of these exchanges of ideas and whatnot. So I think it did have its impact. And it's still having an impact in the movement of Buddhism into Western culture. What non-Asian people who convert to Buddhism or who become interested in Buddhism, what they expect and what type of questions they ask and so on, it is very much driven by expectations and presuppositions that are coming out of the various Protestant traditions, right? So in that light, it again makes Buddhist teachers and whatnot have to dialogue, have to engage, and have to rethink what they've learned to be able to express it in a way that these new questions are soliciting, right? There wasn't a Reformation as such in Buddhism. That's very much a Christian thing. And actually in Asia, generally for Buddhism, it's not doctrine that's the driving force, right? If we look at Indian Buddhism, it's roughly 2,000-year history. The driving force was the monastic rules, right? And we find in records from Chinese travelers and Tibetan travelers and all these people who went to India to study, you would find several different Buddhist philosophical positions being taken by the monks in the monastery, but you would always only find one a monastic rule set, right? So it'd be like, if I can borrow from the Catholic tradition, everybody's a Franciscan, but all the Franciscans aren't in agreement with each other philosophically. So that'd be kind of the equivalent, right? Now, as we move into East Asia, a lot of times the driving force tended to be the grouping of particular scriptures, right? Because Buddhism, Christians have kind of an advantage, is that they have like one major book, right? Now, lots of other secondary, stuff, but one major book. Whereas Buddhism, we got thousands of major books, And so it's way too much for any one group to kind of focus on all of it. And so groupings happen, right? They would group certain scriptures together and say, okay, this is the core of what we're doing. We're not denying that other stuff. That's all, fine. But anyhow, we're doing this. So as Buddhism moved out of India, it became, kind of textual core to a lot of things, or a particular idea that's supported by text. So we could say that Zen wasn't particularly textually driven, but the ideas that drove Zen certainly came out of the texts. The early period of Zen was much more connected with particular texts, but then they started focusing more on the experience and less on the text. Right? So.
Thank you both. Those are great answers to those questions. Maybe as our last question here, as we sort of sum things up, have your traditions been influenced by the idea that it's simply belief in certain propositions rather than a divine experience or an experience by God? So, and I know we touched on this, Terry, you touched on this a little bit when you're talking about kind of some movements within Protestantism that were more sort of doctrinal, and not that they were kind of exempt from this idea that you could experience God, but has that ever happened within your traditions, that it's simply like this maybe sort of a list of like a propositionalism, if you will, and does that still have some influence over movements within Protestantism and in Buddhism?
Well, I think that is less and less true, but certainly an idea that getting correct belief, getting your beliefs sorted out and in the right order, thinking correctly in a systematic way, has been highly valued in the Western Christian tradition, for sure. And again, contemporary Christianity is such a wide and diverse phenomenon. I think you still have groups, there's evidence of groups who place a very high premium on believing certain propositions that act as a litmus test for whether you're in or you're out, whether you're one of us or not. And and then there's sort of great effort made to evaluate compliance with those beliefs. It's kind of like a boundary system. Figuring out who's in and who's out is managed by, do you agree with these beliefs? So I think there's clearly ongoing evidence of that, and to some degree, that is how the church has functioned always, to a certain level of committing to a creedal statement of belief. Do you believe? Yes, I believe, the credo. But I do think that we've also come to sort of the apotheosis of modernity in Christianity has been where that compliance was gained at the cost of, or at the expense, or with the omission of any kind of direct personal experience of the transforming power of God in people's personal lives. And so in a liminal time in late modernity, I think certainly the appeal of experiencing God has quite legitimately been a concern and a focus of interest. Where I think Christians have been fruitfully moving forward is in the way they think about their worship. I think, for example, in the free worship tradition, I'm not talking about Catholics, Anglicans, Lutherans, Presbyterians. I'm thinking of evangelicals who don't come out of a historic set of practices. I think they've begun to discover that worship is more than, and if you think of it, many evangelicals, I think, would regard an experience of corporate worship as primarily about the quality of the experience. I don't know if that makes sense, but you know, a lot of effort goes into it. There's music. It's a sensory rich environment, and it's often geared towards an being a venue for me to express my feelings, but also to experience and feel God's presence. Now, that's a legitimate thing. You know, you see that in revivalism all through the history of the church, two millennia. However, I think what's really interesting is a rediscovery of the role, not so much of propositional belief, but the role of practices, the role of historic practices that Christians have historically always done as avenues or channels for God to act, for this transcendent power of God to change, to transform, to renew, to heal. And you know, that happens through this adherence to some ancient ways of worship. And my final point, and then I'll stop on this, is that I do think there's a growing awareness that our liturgies, our worshiping practices, are not just about the head. It's not about getting the words right. It's about, does this direct our loves and our deepest desires towards the kingdom of God? And I think that is a shift away from a propositional, sort of modern intellectualist focus for what it means to be Christian. To be Christian is, I think, more and more appreciated as defined by what you love ultimately, what you are ultimately loyal to. The inclination, I'm talking like St. Augustine here, the gravity of one's heart, and where is it pulled? You know, in the face of, you know, patriotism and consumerism and egoism, what do we love ultimately? And I think that's a matter of the heart, not the brain. I'll leave it at that.
That's great. Let me give you just a little bit of Buddhist teachings in order to understand how Buddhism sits with this idea of experience versus propositions. I often tell people that Buddhism is kind of the radical application of the idea of cause and effect, in the sense that since everything is in a causal chain, right? There ultimately is nothing. Right? Not nothing in a negative sense, but in the sense that everything is in the process of changing. And so whatever you think it is, if you think it's a table, yes, it might be a table right now, but it's in the process of becoming something else, right? You know, a bunch of sawdust or whatever, right? So in this type of sense. And so the idea behind a lot of Buddhism is to lower the ego always, okay? Now, understanding that it's about lowering the ego. When we look at some Buddhist sects in Asia and almost all of what's going on with Buddhism in the West, it's very experientially focused on directly trying to do this as much as possible, right? And so that's the meditation tradition, right? The meditation tradition is to get past the ego. Now, there's all sorts of techniques that you can use and so on and so forth. But anyhow, that's really kind of the crux of it. Right? So Westerners looking at Buddhism see it as, you know, this experiential system that tries to lessen the ego in big steps. Okay. Yes, of course, in Asia, as I said, you do have some traditions that kind of have that type of focus. But generally, most people think those steps are too big, right? So we're just going to take little steps to do this, right? So we can become a nun or we can become a monk And, by living that kind of restrained life, we're slowly lessening the ego, right? By going to the temple every morning and making offerings and doing bowings and all of this type of stuff, we're lowering the ego, right? And we might not, make big strides in this lifetime. We're progressing, and then, we get all that good karma in next lifetime. We can do a little more, right? So on both sides, the aim is the same thing, but they're in Asia. They don't think that they're going to make these big jumps. It's going to be little steps for most people. Whereas in the West, they think, yeah, we can, accomplish a lot if we really put our minds to it. Right? So it is very much experientially driven, right? Understanding, the term experience within the framework of the disciplines and whatnot that are available within the tradition, right? This doesn't mean that there isn't a very profound and very elaborate philosophy. It's based on all sorts of propositions, right? The Buddhists were very much in the vanguard of developing logic in India, right? And a lot of people say that it was the Buddhists who came up with the idea of zero, right? If you look at Roman times, there's no Roman numeral for zero because they didn't have such a concept. You could have, you could have minus things like you owed 5, or you could have plus things, you had 5, but there was no zero, right? And so that may have developed out of Buddhist philosophy. So there is, that whole tradition, but that whole tradition was seen as an aid to and not a substitute for the experiential side. So, but it is, it's a very interesting thing in our world currently, modern world, that this, so many things are based on this whole propositional system, and then as Terry was saying, you have to state your faith in whatever the propositions are to be in that in with the in crowd. So,
Tony, maybe a question for you. Do you think that, and this is just something off the top of my head, do you think that maybe it's the influence of sort of a Christian mentality, that this is like the only life to live, that maybe people have this almost like this impetus rather than like a long view of life, you know what I mean? That like, we have to get this done. I have to solve the ego in my life because I only have sort of 40 years to live, versus maybe a different mentality where this is a succession of multiple lives and things like that.
Yeah, I do think it's very much a Western phenomenon. I think that's part of it. I also think that because of the Enlightenment, Western people in general do not see ourselves limited by certain contexts, right? Now, some of that's good. I mean, a physicist working on something, not feeling limited by Newton's physics, right? Guy called the Einstein, right? He came up with like a whole nother thing that really helped, explain things that we couldn't explain before without overthrowing what Isaac Newton had done, right? But that's very much part of the Western, the Western modern model, right? I think both of these aspects are important.
And I just wanted to add to what Tony has said, that if you look at some puzzling phenomena, for example, I found it very hard to believe that a high percentage of Christians subscribe to a certain political persuasion. I'm speaking south of the border in this context, but and would vote in a certain way. And I mean, I wonder what's going on there when it strikes me, and maybe this is hubris on my part, but I look at it and think that this strikes me as antithetical to the way of Jesus Christ, and I'm asking myself, what's going on there? I don't think you can explain those kinds of puzzling moral and religious phenomena by saying, well, we just need to get our beliefs sorted out. We need to have some good, sort of propositional realignment, because we're not getting it clear in our heads. I think something much more subtle is going on there. It's about our fears, our loves, our loyalties. It's about the shape of our desires. And that is something you can't really think or argue your way into. As James K. Smith says, you don't argue someone into becoming a consumerist. That's formed by habits and practices and institutions, and it's a way of life. We become that way. And someone might say, well, this looks like who you are. And you'd say, well, I didn't choose that. I just am. And I think in a similar way, Tony's describing practices centered around reducing the ego. No one says, here, think this argument through and you'll get your ego reduced to where it ought to be. I just don't think that's the way religiosity works, when we understand it and when we get our anthropology right about the way we wet, our wetware and our hardware and all that. We just are much more complex beings, and to define our spirituality or the religious way that gives meaning simply by reducing it to a set of propositions just is hopelessly inadequate. It's a truncated view of the human religious experience, I would say.
Yeah, I very much agree.
Makes me think of, as Terry, as you say that there's a Christian philosopher who sort of argues against, he says they're okay, the arguments for the existence of God, but he says at the end of the day, kind of like continually trying to argue for the existence of God is kind of like, he compares it to a husband who always questions his wife whenever she comes back to the house. Where were you? Why weren't you here? Things like that. Like, argumentation cannot be the fullness of humanity and religion and philosophy and everything else. It's to put it down to those things is simply to miss a big section. So maybe if we can conclude on that, any final thoughts or anything else, Dr. Barber or Dr. Fach?
I think this has been a wonderful conversation. I've learned a lot from Terry, and I think excellent questions from you, Father. And it's great to be able to sit down with people who have similar interests and passions and whatnot, and talk, right? One of the big problems, I think, in especially in the 21st century, is that people don't spend enough time talking to each other. Just sit down and talk. We're all just people, right? Yeah. We're all dealing with the same stuff, right? And so it's great to just listen. You don't have to always agree. You can just listen and say, okay, I have some understanding. I have some connection. I have some sympathy for other ways of approaching things, right? It's just wonderful.
Yeah, I would concur with what Tony just said. I look forward to more conversations with interfaith brothers and sisters, and appreciate the opportunity to be involved in this. Honestly, we're part of institutions, many of us, but those institutions are part of this wider human phenomena of making meaning, trying to figure out meaning for our lives. And in that sense, we have a lot in common, and we can learn a lot from each other.
Amen. Well, thank you guys so much. And thank you for all our viewers. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.